Science Podcast. My name is Tyler Bublitz, and welcome back to the 19th Sunday after Pentecost for the week of October 19th, 2025. I'm excited to have you here. I'm excited to get into this week's podcast, and I'm excited just first and foremost, I got to just say kind of a personal thing. I kind of mentioned a little bit last week. My wife and I have been wrestling through a lot of different things, and we, this last weekend, accomplished a goal that I have had for quite a while. We both ran a half marathon, and body is feeling it, but we were able to accomplish a goal. We were both able to do it better than what we expected, especially with what our bodies have been going through. But it's been kind of fun. There's a lot of different things at some point, probably something else that I'll get into talking about. There's just a lot of meaning to it for me, and I'm still kind of processing that. But that's kind of been one big thing for me that I've been able to accomplish over this last week. And I feel like impartially, if we're digging in and we're going through text every week, I do feel like there's a personal aspect of this. And I want to definitely give a lot of shout outs to my wife and my parents and my sister and her husband being able to come out and support us. And there was a lot of other people in the community who were able to come out and support us. And I thank you so much for that. Really makes a big difference when you're on a run like that. But it also kind of plays a little bit into the question that we had for last week, believe it or not, and which was, where do we need to give thanks? And I think one of the responses we got back this last week, I think did a great job at kind of summarizing it, is it's really difficult for us to give adequate thanks. In fact, when we have this podcast go out, it is my sister's birthday. Happy birthday, Britt. But also it is Canadian Thanksgiving. So for Canadian listeners, happy Thanksgiving. But it makes sense. We can never give enough thanks to God for everything that God has done for us and what God continues to do for us. But I think it is also really important for us to slow down and try to give thanks to those people. I know that's really difficult. I know that's really hard. I know it can be very difficult to wrap our heads around. But I think it's a very humbling experience, and I think it's very necessary within our own faith walk to be able to recognize things where God is doing things, recognize the gifts that are in front of us, recognizing the things where we might have a natural leg up on something and giving thanks for that, recognizing that, which then also allows us to be able to extend our hands and help others who aren't necessarily as benefited in whatever way, which I think then it really helps us to be able to be the image of Christ a lot more. And the more we're able to do that, the more we're able to be like Christ. And in a lot of ways, I would argue it's a very important part of our faith walk and our prayer life that I think a lot of times gets overlooked very easily. But let's just jump into it this week. The semi-continuous Old Testament text is from Jeremiah chapter 31, verses 27 to 34. This is one of the sections here where Israel has continued to be wandering around and continued to be going through things, and it's God reiterating to his people, there is something that's greater that is coming. There is something that I am about to do that's going to change the game forever, and I'm going to make a new covenant with my people, that this will be embedded on their hearts. This will be forever with them. It's not going to be like these commandments in stone that can be broken. This is going to be something that's going to be in them. It's going to be part of them, and it's going to be able to bring us closer together and be able to bring the relationship between us as humans and understanding who God is closer and closer. And especially being on this side of the cross, we understand more what that covenant is. But I can imagine being the people of Israel hearing this from the prophet Jeremiah, wondering what that's going to mean and when that's going to happen. The psalm that goes with that is Psalm 199, verses 97 to 104. And I think the first verse is just an amazing thing for us to be hearing, which is hard for our ears to hear in this time and in this place. Oh, how I love your law. It is my meditation all day long. But it's this recognition on how the commandments and the things that God has laid out for his people have made things overall better for the people of Israel. That as they continue to walk the path, even though it might be difficult, even though it might be hard, it gets them to the places where God wants them to be. And when they get there, you start getting how sweet your words are to taste sweeter than honey in my mouth. Through your precepts, I get understanding. Therefore, I hate every false way. This recognition on as we are listening to God and continue to move in the direction of where God is calling us, things are better, even though it might not seem like that in the current present moment. The other Old Testament text this week is out of Genesis chapter 32, verses 22 to 31. This is, I would again argue, a text that is semi-familiar, but this is a moment where Jacob has robbed the blessing that was due to Esau by stealing it, by pretending to be Esau. And as Jacob has received this blessing and has fled, and for now years has been running around and is moving toward Esau at this moment. And this is a moment then where Jacob is alone and he's wrestling God, is what we understand. But they wrestle all night long. And it's this physical manifestation of God here. Jacob is wrestling and God pops Jacob's hip out of socket, but Jacob keeps wrestling, keeps going. And as the day is about to break, Jacob is stating, I will not let go unless you bless me. And God's confirming who this is, that it's Jacob. And then Jacob asks, what is your name? And God responds with, why do you ask my name? And God blesses him. And so they get this Peniel, which is name for I have seen the face of God, yet my life is preserved. And we get then Jacob limping off, and the presumed idea that Jacob then has this defect or injured hip the rest of his life, but has wrestled with God all night long. The psalm that goes with that then is Psalm 121, all 8 verses of it. And it's a fairly familiar psalm, especially starting in verse 1. I lift my eyes to the hills. Where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord who makes heaven and earth. But it's also this recognition on how you help us not stumble. You help Israel. You are the keeper. You're the one who has made sure and to help prevail us. And as we then continue to go, make sure that we recognize and continue to be turning toward you. The second reading or epistle text this reading is from 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 14 through chapter 4, verse 5. And this is this moment of recognition on us acknowledging the teachings of what Christ has done and how that has worked and what has that all meant. And then because of this then should be a reason for us to live this out. This is a reason for us to proclaim this message, as it states in verse 2, whether the time is favorable or unfavorable, convenient, rebuke, and encourage with utmost patience in teaching. This recognition on what Christ has done, the covenant that Christ has made with us, that this is something that we should be doing in our day-to-day lives. This should be part of who we are. It should be embedded in who we are, and that this is something that sets us apart. And it shouldn't be because we feel it's convenient or easy to be doing. This is something we just should be doing. The gospel text this week is out of Luke chapter 18, verses 1 to 8. Jesus is telling a parable, talking about how we need to pray and not lose heart. And he gives this parable, the example that there is this judge who neither feared God nor had respect for people. And this woman comes to him saying, grant me justice against my accuser. And he refuses. And later to himself, he says, though I have no fear of God and no respect for anyone, yet this widow keeps bothering me. And I will grant her justice, so that she may not wear me out continually coming. And this is what Jesus is stating. Do you not feel that God is more just than this unjust judge? Do you not recognize that continuing to call upon God and continuing to be in relationship and talking with God, that there is times where God will then continue to grant some of these things that are weighing heavy on your heart? So before we jump into how faith and science come together this week, we do a shameless plugs. Working Preacher. If you have a checked out Working Preacher, I'd highly recommend it. Between their Sermon Brainwaves podcasts, their commentaries, their discussions. Since I'm not an ordained minister, I use them on a weekly basis to help me give me some ideas, direction, different ways to be looking at the text, and some amazing, different, deep commentaries and theological discussion about these texts. So if you enjoy listening to this podcast week after week, I know you're going to enjoy listening to workingpreacher.org and checking out the additional resources they have over there. I'd also highly recommend checking out the Green Blades Preaching Roundtable and the Green Blades Rising publication. This is either a weekly reflection or a monthly newsletter going through ecological echoes, implications, and urgencies to be brought up into your weekly preaching, along with the idea of different ecological issues and things to be thinking about from a more ecological lens. So if you enjoy listening to this podcast week after week for a half an hour, and you enjoy thinking about things from more of an ecological lens, I'd really highly recommend checking out Green Blades Preaching Roundtable and the Green Blades Rising publications. Those links will be the first link down in the references section down in the show notes below. And it's just an amazing resource to make sure that you are checking out. Finally, I'd also highly recommend checking out the Revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Divinity Library. I really enjoy how they lay out the text week to week, but also having liturgical art, prayers, hymns, colors, other daily devotions to help prepare you week after week. This is a really great resource to help prepare you, whether you are in front of the pews or in the pews on Sunday morning. Just being able to have daily devotions that are helping you prepare for the week upcoming and going into the text in a little bit deeper way. Or maybe going through some of the liturgical art on how people have perceived these different texts and looking at them from different artists from all over the world and throughout different times, going through different prayers and thinking about how some of that could be utilized. This is an amazing resource. So if you haven't checked that out, checking out the Revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Divinity Library, I'd highly recommend it. There's a small detail that comes out of the gospel text this week that I think is vital for us to be thinking about. And I think within that, it gives us also some insight into things that we need to be thinking about as a society, even today, that we are still struggling with. So one of the things that I know we have talked about multiple times on this podcast is specifically whenever women are brought up, it usually means something important is happening. And did you catch it? The widow who is going and seeing the unjust judge is female. The widow is coming and asking for justice against my accuser. What does this actually all mean? It means something that we have to be thinking deeply about. And it's really easy in the world today when we throw around the word justice a lot to potentially lose a little bit of what that meaning really is and to really get the angst of what that is. Or to feel like a lot of the justice has been served, that we've made significant progress. But what if I laid out something that showed that we really still, at least even here in the United States, have really struggled with this concept of justice, specifically within our healthcare system. And I'm not necessarily stating within minority groups, which that's a whole nother topic for another day, but I'm literally talking 50% of the healthcare system has not been served well over the last 100 years. And I would state that women's health has not been served well over the last 100 years here in the United States. Let me give you a quick example right off the top. Over the last 60 years, there has been 640 studies on menstrual blood. In that same period of time, there has been over 15,000 studies on male semen. That's a ratio of one study on female menstrual blood to 23 studies on male semen. And what does that lead to? It leads to issues within reproductive health within women in general. And part of this gets back to, I found a really great video from Today I Learned Science on YouTube, going through 3 major disruptions that happened within women's health within the last basically 60 to 75 years. That has really made a lot of progress within specifically women's health and reproductive health very, very difficult. And we're going to go through that a little bit and we're going to talk about it a little bit. And I think it helps gives us a little bit of insight here into Luke and the other texts in general. So give me a few minutes and we can get back to how does this all tie in. The first one is thalidomide, which came out in the mid-1950s, specifically in Europe. And the guide was, this was something that women took when they were dealing with morning sickness. And it seemed to be doing great. It was then being pushed in 1960s to the FDA here in the United States and was seen, yeah, it looks great. But Dr. Frances Oldham Kelsey just couldn't get past the lack of safety data. In fact, she blocked it for 19 months and took a lot of crap on Capitol Hill because she wasn't just passing this through, and 4 times denied it. The big thing that she looked at, that there was a lot of anecdotal or personal accounts as evidence instead of clinical research. one of the claims that thalidomide had was there was no lethal dose of thalidomide. In that 19 months, while she was holding off and trying to say, I need more clinical research, the worst case scenario started coming out. That babies were dying or having severe limb deformities coming out of Europe. And there was two major discoveries that came from this. One, that oral drugs could impact/harm a growing fetus or baby. And two was something called chirility, which these are molecules that can mirror each other. Think of it like your left hand and right hand. They're mirrors of each other, but if you stack them on top of each other, they don't fit perfectly on top of each other. In that, these molecules are the same way. And the problem is that one version would help with the morning sickness and the other would cause limb deformities and was doing it by stopping blood vessels from forming correctly. The problem is that this molecule could flip within the body back and forth. So this then prevented the approval in the 60s of this in the United States and kind of rolled it back in Europe. But then there was this whole small generation of people who have dealt with this. But then we roll into upset number 2, diethylstilbestrol or DES. And what was happening was miscarriage for anybody is very difficult for a couple. And the theory or hypothesis in the 1940s was there was not enough estrogen in the body of these women, which was causing the problem. Unfortunately, in 1953, there was a study that showed that didn't work, but it was still pushed for over 30 years, this DES. And in 1971, there was a study coming out of UMass that women between 15 and 22 were getting this rare cancer of clear cell adenocarcinoma. And when they started getting into this, that these were women whose mothers took DES. Then they started to look into the men who were sons of women who were taking DES and noticed that there were testicular abnormalities and again also higher cancer risk, and then found that this was then affecting potentially the grandchildren as well. And so this was kind of the second major bullet to women's health. And that leads us to finally the Delcon Shield IUD, which was coming out again in the 1970s. And there was a couple major issues that we learned from this. Was first, that the string filament that they made was a multi-filament, which allowed for the ability for bacteria to get up and have growths, which then would cause infection, but also just weird bacterial growth within that. Also, the shape of the IUD caused a lot of poor placement, which caused a lot of failures, infections, and potential pregnancies, which, like many of these other drugs, with the lack of testing on women, they were rushing it to market. They had misinformation that was out in the market fairly easily, saying that women did not need to have it removed before having their accidental pregnancy, and led to multiple women dying because of this. And this then has also led to a lot of misconceptions around IUDs in general, that they're pushed as this is a simple day operation. You come in, it goes in, it's not a big issue, and that you're able to go home on your own, or having them removed is the same way. And this gets very difficult because specifically for women, where this is being inserted near the cervix, there are 3 major nerves that are all coming together: the pelvic splenic nervus, the hypogastric plexus, and the pudendal nerve. All are coming together, which then makes it also very difficult to be able to have even pain-relieving drugs for this type of thing happening. Now, as we've kind of gone through a lot of this different research, the question then kind of becomes, why hasn't there been good research with women? And one of the major reasons that people will say is because no one wanted to harm pregnant women and specifically their unborn children. And that makes a lot of sense. But the other major reason on why there hasn't been a lot of women within clinical stuff within health is convenience. Women are much more complicated internally than men, just with having their cycles and hormones, and that they're just bigger effects. And this has led to, even when we're doing trials on animals and such, that we won't even use female animals. They were only testing the males. And this got us to this point where we were trying to have this reference man or standard human that was 25 to 30 Caucasian and 70 kilograms or about 155 pounds. And that's kind of led us into a lot of problems because that isn't what women are. Women are not men. They're not smaller men. It's also meant that there's a lot of times like how we approach birth control currently within the United States is to flatline the hormones. And now we're starting to recognize that maybe isn't the best thing that we're doing. And that's partially why when we're looking at the blood from menstrual cycles being so important, being able to help us being able to potentially diagnose endometriosis early, and especially that endometriosis affects 1 in 10 women, I feel like this is an important thing that we should be looking at. And if you think about this isn't even that recent that we've allowed women back into clinical research. Women were reintroduced into clinical research here in the United States in 1993 due to the powerful work of Dr. Florence Hellstein and Representative Max Schroeder, who also then made sure in that bill that it allowed for minority groups to also be included. This has also gotten to where we're starting to have more women physicians that are coming into the field and starting to also question some things. For instance, we are also noticing that Alzheimer's disease seems to be affecting women's brains more than men's. But then we're doing all the different tests on male rats and male humans. That doesn't make sense. That's not justice. That's not thinking through the process. I understand as a scientist why they were wanting to take hormones and the fluctuations because it is another variable and it makes things more difficult. It makes it harder to work with the data. But it's a vital, important aspect of women in general and who they are and how their body works. We've talked about the potential benefits in previous podcasts, talking about what menstrual blood potentially could be doing. And I'll attach another episode down below from Today I Learned in Science, and I haven't been able to actually get through it myself. I'm hoping to next week, but talking about some of the research that is being done, looking at trying to have some early diagnosis of endometriosis. And for me, that is a little bit personal because my mother struggled with this, and it was after different surgical procedures I was even able to be born. And it's sad to me to be thinking about that this is the world in which we're in, when we're trying to see that people are people, whether they are male or female, or on a gradient in between. But it's the aspect of why are we saying that certain ones are worth doing and researching and others aren't? When we think about justice and thinking about that we have to keep fighting for this, we have to keep working, and how hard women have continued to have to fight. Even just looking here in the United States, starting in the 1920s with the suffrage movement and giving them the right to be able to vote. But that here we are about 100 years later, and we're finding that even in the last 30 years, we have finally given them the permission again to be part of clinical studies. There is a lot of work that still needs to be done, and it means that we need to continue to have our eyes open. It's not always going to be male, female. It's not always going to be Caucasian versus other minority groups here in the United States. There are other times that it's maybe a little bit more hidden. There's this aspect that we have to continue to work hard and continue to see it and look for it and speak up to it, whether it's convenient or not, as we are hearing in the 2 Timothy text. And I think this is an aspect of who our character as humans, as Christians should be, is that we are recognizing things and being a vessel for that. Being that who we are as people be part of our message of us acknowledging who Christ is within us, acknowledging that covenant that has been written on our hearts, as it was talked about in Jeremiah, that this is then part of who we are. If it's written on our hearts, it is pumping through our veins, every heartbeat, every moment. It is what is allowing us to live, allowing our bodies and muscles to get the oxygen for the support for our bodies to be able to live. Thus, we need to be living this out. And yes, there is times it's going to be difficult. There are going to be times that we are wrestling with God, similar to what Jacob went through, where there is times of why do I have to keep fighting this? Why do I have to keep going even though this feels difficult? Why do I have to sit here in the 21st century and be stating that we need to make sure that we are treating women with the same respect within the healthcare system, and specifically within the reproductive healthcare system as men? Because it takes two to tango. It takes both parties in order for a new birth to happen. We have to be able to recognize this. We have to be able to recognize that there are times that there are struggles that people are going through and be willing to hear them out. We need to be able to recognize that there are times it's going to be a long and treacherous and a difficult battle, on a battle that you don't feel like you should be going through. And the Israelites are the perfect people to be talking about. We are the chosen people of Israel. We are the chosen people. But how long, God? How long? How long? We hear that in the Psalms. We see that in the Old Testament time and time and time again. But yet they are persistent. Yet they realize they keep coming back, they keep praying about it, and God does not abandon them. We should be able to take that and learn from that. Jesus is helping us to acknowledge it's not that God ever goes a blind ear to you. God hears it and continues to work with it. And even those times that it seems like it's unrational that it'll ever happen, God still has a way of making it happen. So the question I have for you this week is, where do you need to pray persistently? Where do you need to pray persistently? I know for me, one of the last couple weeks leading up to this half marathon, a lot of it was for my health, but specifically my wife's. I had seen the amount of work and effort that she was going into, and how, honestly, she was very concerned if she was even able to do the run. After the months of training, to suddenly be getting to the point where, just to put it bluntly, a week and a half before the race, she was diagnosed with a sinus infection. She was having trouble breathing. And yet to think that a week and a half later, she goes and runs a race, I would say in and of itself, it's the blessings of the doctors being able to help her, the blessings of God working in and amongst her body in ways that we can't fully all understand, working within the doctors initially to be able to help diagnose, to get her well, and giving her the strength to be able to do it. Do we take that time to recognize that? Do we take the time ahead of time to be praying about it? Do we not recognize these moments on where God is continuing to be within our lives? These are the moments that we also should be celebrating and recognizing, like we are talking about in 2 Timothy, acknowledging that this is part of who God created us to be, and acknowledging God and what has happened, and having that become part of who we are and how we share the amazing message of who God is. That God doesn't leave us. God doesn't abandon us. God is with us and walking with us and going through it with us. And when God is seeing injustice, that God is also putting that on our hearts so that we feel the injustice and try to work with God to do something about the injustice. And sometimes it's simple as just continuing to pray about it and acknowledging that there's times where it's beyond what we as one singular human being can do, but it's not outpowering what God can do. And the good thing with us calling upon God and God being the rightful judge that God is, God can separate where it's our own pride praying for something and where God is calling us and recognizing this is what I have been calling and I'm wanting them to acknowledge, and I'm going to put my hand in this some to help. I think we need to be able to look at stories like this with women's reproductive health, but various other places, and acknowledge these places where growth needs to happen. And from that, then allow ourselves the ability to be able to move forward and help get us toward the justice that is deserved. And in doing that, I think we actually start to see more and more of the face and the image of who God is calling us to be. There are going to be times where we are wrestling with God like Jacob, and we're just saying, just bless this already. Just have this be done, God. How long must we wait? How long is the night that we need to keep wrestling you? We know you're all-powerful and all-knowing. Just why can't you just do it? Why do we have to keep wrestling? And these are questions, I think, at times that we may never get the answers fully to. And it's things that we probably can talk to God about when we get there. But it's the aspect, too, of acknowledging that we don't just turn a blind eye to it. We continue to work on it and work through it, because that's part of what our faith should mean. It means that we take action on things. We show love and care in places that need it. So, we'll wrap this up as we always do. I pray God blesses you through your faith and amazes you through science.